Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We are doing the Comprehensivist Wednesday today, and it's wonderful to have Phil, and he's going to be talking about structuralism. And I will let him introduce the topic and the principal thinker that we are looking at today. So Phil, the floor is all yours.
Hello, everyone. So today we are discussing Ferdinand de Saussure and his contribution to primarily two fields, linguistics and semiotics. But as Shrikant mentioned, the work that he did became really quite influential in a lot of other disciplines. So structuralism is mentioned in the meetup description, and structuralism was a concept that essentially grew out of his work, and we'll talk about how his ideas in linguistics gave rise to the ideas of structuralism, which then kind of really seeped into all kinds of disciplines like anthropology with Lévi-Claude Strauss, and psychology with Piaget. And so there's just a lot of various tentacles that they were spread after his work. So his work was really foundational, and I thought it would be good for us to talk a little bit about what he did, some of his seminal ideas, and just discuss what we think about it now. Now, I have to mention at the outset, linguistics is a very interesting field, because unlike, let's say, physics or chemistry, where you have pretty much established consensus on most things, linguistics is still very much a hotly debated subject. And while there are certain things that are pretty much fixed, but the big questions are still very much in play. And so that's why Saussure's ideas are still controversial and still up for debate, and there are various schools of thought around the way he thinks. So we'll just talk about what he thinks, and then maybe at a later point we'll talk about some of the reception and criticisms and so on. So Saussure lived in the last half of the 19th century. He was born in 1857, died in 1913. He was born in Geneva, studied in Switzerland, and he studied primarily languages, unsurprisingly. His father was a bit of a polymath, from what I understand. He was just a really interesting person. But Ferdinand de Saussure himself, he studied languages that were pretty common in Europe at the time. Everybody who was educated took a course, knew Latin, knew ancient Greek rather. So Saussure was no exception. But he also studied Sanskrit, which I thought was interesting, because Sanskrit really opened up linguistics like a Swiss Army knife, and I guess the first thing I guess we should talk about is a little bit of history of linguistics as a discipline, which Saussure does in his book on it's called, I think, the short course in linguistics or something like that, and he basically goes over the current state of the field up to his time, and then then his own contributions to it. And so linguistics started out primarily as a study of grammar. So grammar was one of those, if you know the medieval scholasticism and the program that was there, you had the study of grammar, you had the study of speaking and dialectic. And so grammar was one of the three primary sciences, I guess, that you studied as an undergrad, and then as a graduate you would go on to math, music, and astronomy and things like that. So that was grammar was pretty much synonymous with linguistics. And what does grammar give us? Well, it just gives us the rules of a particular language, how it's structured. In Latin, it's all very well understood and structured, and in English and all the other languages, you have kind of the proper way of saying things and the rules around that. But it doesn't really go beyond that. So it's very descriptive in nature. Like, in fact, most sciences started out as being just descriptive. You just cataloged what you observed, and grammar was no exception. It didn't really deal with why things are the way they are. It just describes the way things are. It's just like you learn in school. You have the object, the subject, the nouns, the verbs, and so on, but nobody tells you why everything is the way it is. And so Saussure uses this as a sort of a starting point, just saying, okay, well, we have grammar. Then what happened next was philology. And philology, obviously still a science today, is a study of texts and how to interpret texts. And that was, of course, built all around the Bible and the Christian tradition, because that's what people did. As they read the Bible, they read the texts of the church fathers, and they wanted to understand how to interpret it, right? So you had hermeneutics, and you had all sorts of adjunct disciplines built around that. So that was the second one. So grammar, philology. And then the third thing that really started to revolutionize everything was this discovery that you can actually take languages and start comparing them to one another. And Sanskrit played a huge role in that, because Sanskrit obviously came way, from way out here in India. And how does it relate to anything European? But amazingly, and of course, and Shrikant, you can probably give us some much more details since you know Sanskrit. People started realizing that there are all sorts of words that are they have a lot in common with a lot of European languages. And this gave rise to this theory that, in fact, Sanskrit and the European languages share a common ancestor. Just like in biology, people realized the same thing when they looked at different animals and started doing comparative anatomy. Comparative linguistics did the same for languages, and it really propelled the study of linguistics as a science that tries to answer the question, what is language? How does it change? Are there rules around these changes? And what it is that we're trying to actually study here. The first thing you want to do in a new science is define your object of study. And that turned out to be the most crucial and in some ways very challenging question that Saussure wanted to answer right away. And he said, okay, well, what is it that we are studying? Because it's not very clear. It's not very clearly defined, because there are a lot of other disciplines that tend to convolute the playing field, because language doesn't exist in abstraction. Language exists in history. It's tied to institutions. It's tied to culture. It's tied to a lot of other things, geography, right? So there's all kinds of, it's this tangled web. And I think the main contribution of Saussure was to untangle this complicated web and really put things in classify things in a very clear way that allows us to think about language in general, and then be able to ask the right questions, because that's really what's crucial when you're trying to develop something new. Is you're trying to understand the object of your study, and then you're trying to understand what are the important questions that you can formulate, and then you start hypothesizing on how to answer that. So so right there, the question of object, right? So let's say you have a word, and Saussure being a French speaker, he uses a lot of French words. So he says, we have this word in French, nude, which in English is nude or bare. So what is nude? What are we studying when we study, when we look at this word? Are we studying the sound, the phonetics, the rules that describe why this sounds a particular way?
Phil, can I make a comment before
Sure.
we go into detail? So firstly, this is really a fascinating topic, and forget about structuralism, because that is like you're saying that's the consequence. I mean, what Saussure is doing here on language itself is the core interest of what we are doing. So even if we just at the end just touch upon structuralism, that's fine. Second, so I wanted to respond to your comment about Sanskrit. And I think the analogy that you drew between languages and species is a very good one, because before Darwin, everybody thought that the species were static. And that's all the species that they were, because they didn't travel much. They just saw the animals that they did, and they never really changed, So it was like a snapshot at a particular place, at a particular time. And that's how most people think of language. language is, this is my language, that's all there is. And something amazing happens when Darwin goes to South America. He gets down and he finds all this tremendous variety of animals, which are related, similar to the animals back home, but very different. So there are commonalities, and suddenly the idea of species expands. It expands in geography and it expands in time. So people become aware that species change over time. And in different places, they proliferate in very different directions, even when they have the same base, same source. So something analogous to that, happened in linguistic when people came. Saussure was one of them. I think there is another guy who came up with the idea. I forget his name now. I think Williams or something, but he was a Britisher who traveled to India, and he saw these different languages there, and he saw them, because imagine it is like Darwin. He's looking down, and there are 20 different species of beetles. Similarly, this guy goes to India, and there are all these different languages, and he starts to see similarities between them. And there comes the idea of family of language. Family is such a potent word, where it kind of captures the commonality as well as distinction all in one. And so just wanted to put that in, but please go on.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. So there's definitely that lens of looking at language as a living thing, just like in biology we look at living things evolving. But going back to this idea that first we have to define the object of this new discipline, linguistics, which again, it didn't exist really. We had grammar, we had philology, but linguistics as a science did not really exist until Saussure made his observations, and then it really started taking off. So, so what is the object of linguistics then? Going back to my example with looking at a particular word, well, you can study the phonetics, the sounds, and why different languages have different sounds, and how related languages have similar sounds, and so on. So there's that. Then you can say, okay, well, nu, the word nu in French means bare, nude, and so on. So there's a concept involved. And what is that? Like, how does that play into language? The idea that all these words, they're not just sounds, they have meaning, right? So the meaning part of it, we need to figure that out, right? How does that relate to this? And the third one is you have words and how they interrelate from different languages. So you have, we translate one word to another, and so we have these concepts that are connected across languages, and maybe they're not well connected. Some of them are better connected, and some of them might, be descendants of each other, and so on. So there's a lot of uncertainty when you start out. It's not a simple clear-cut answers. What are we going to study in this linguistics discipline? And so the very first thing or the first contribution conceptually that Saussure makes is this: he makes a distinction between what he calls language and speech. In French, it's langue and parole. Parole is speech, and it's the spoken language, what each of us engage in every day. Now, langue or language is a system, right, that we use for our speech. So they're related, but they're not the same. And the way or the way you can think of it is, if you think of an iceberg and you see kind of the top of it above the water, that's parole. That's the language, that's the speech that we use every day, and people use it slightly differently, and you see different parts of that iceberg. But underneath it all, what makes it all possible is the unseen part of that, the langue. That's the system that underlies the speech. Without that system, we could not speak, because we would not understand each other. So that's the first interesting distinction that he makes: the spoken language versus the abstract system that allows that spoken language to exist. And the Lange and Pajol dichotomy, it's interesting. It's a chicken and egg type of thing. It's not clear which one came first. If you think about it, you can't really have the system without the speakers. At the same time, the speakers need a system to communicate. And so it's a very interesting question about how these two came together, but obviously they had to have come in some sort of interaction. They had to emerge from some sort of interaction back and forth, feeding into each other. And right there's an interesting subject matter for study, is this relationship between spoken language and the system. So that's number one. The second one, we talked about, words have sounds, words have meanings. And so the second part is to focus on just the meaning, and that becomes the study of semantics rather. Semantics deals with the meaning and how it's related to the words. Now, the words themselves, this is where the second contribution of Saussure comes in. The word itself is an interesting thing. So, words for most of us, we think of them as sounds, right? I'm talking to you, you're hearing me. I am formulating something in my head, then I am uttering it with my vocal cords. You're hearing it, decoding it, and it becomes hopefully some sort of concept again that's akin to what I was trying to put across, right? So there's this constant flow of sounds and meanings back and forth, right? I'm encoding, speaking, you're decoding, and it goes back into this loop. So, but what happens if for people that are deaf or mute and they cannot hear and they cannot speak? Well, they still have a way to communicate, and the way they communicate is through sign language, right? So there's a different way of specifying something using a different modality of communication. Now think of written language. Even if you cannot speak, you can possibly still write, and someone else can decode it purely through visual apparatus. So the thing to understand and to note, and that Saussure notes, is that there is a commonality in all of this, which is the common denominator here is you have some sort of semantical load that you're communicating, but the methods of communication are separate from that, and in some ways independent. And that becomes the leading point to his insight that, in fact, the way we assign this significance to these concepts is somewhat arbitrary, because we can come up with 10 different ways of communicating the same concept. We can communicate it through language, or rather through sound. We can communicate through writing. We can communicate it through sign language. There are probably other ways we can communicate it, but it's still the same, conceptually, possibly the same thing, hopefully, right? That we're delivering from point A to point B. And so he makes this really seminal construct, which he calls a sign. And a sign is a connection between some concept, which he calls signified, and the way you associate that with some image. Now, he used the word sound image because primarily he was talking about speech, parole, but it could be a written image, it could be a sign language image. It's an image. Together, an image and a concept is a sign. A sign is made up of two parts: signifier, that's the image part, and signified, that's the concept. So if you draw a circle, that's the sign, and then you put a line across that circle. At the top is the concept, the signified, and the bottom is the image, the sound image, primarily is what he was talking about, but any kind of image that's associated with in our heads with that concept, and that's the signifier. And so the seminal thing that Saussure and I guess we should stop here. The seminal thing that he proposed is the following. The connection between the signified and the signifier is arbitrary. In other words, you can pick any signifier for a signified. And in fact, that's why we have different languages, because we have done that. We have picked different words to connect to the same concept. That's why I can say something in English, in Russian, in Shrikant can say it in Sanskrit. Somebody else can say it in a different language. We're all thinking about the same thing, but we've used different sound images to ascribe or to delineate that meaning. So I'll stop here because I think that's probably the key. If there's nothing else we talk about tonight, that is the key takeaway from tonight's session, is this idea of the sign and signifier / signified connection. That that's how the sign is created, is when that connection is made. So I'll stop here. So I don't know, Shrikant, if you want to make any comments or questions or anything else.
No, let me just throw it open for anybody who wants to comment on anything. You can ask questions, you can make comments. I would like it to be interactive, so go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question. We'll start with Allison. Allison, go ahead.
One thing that I think is always interesting is how sometimes different languages have words for things that we don't have a word for in English. And, when people will say, well, I'm trying to figure out how to say it because there isn't really a word in English. So they'll kind of describe it, or, like they can kind of get close to the word, but it's never quite there because it's not the same. I always think that's kind of interesting.
Do you have an example?
I can't think of one off the head, but I studied French for 8 years, and I remember there were lots of times that there were things that I came up with, but I can't think of any right off the top of my head.
How did you know what they meant?
I don't know, but I got to, like, there was a while where I was going to France a lot, and I was kind of thinking half in English and half in French. And sometimes like the French words just made more sense for it.
Well, we'll get to that in just a second, Allison, because you raised a great point about, first of all of us learn language instinctively. We don't think about it. We learn it as kids. Some of us learn language as an adult much harder. But in any case, when we learn it, have you ever asked yourself how do kids learn language? I mean, we don't sit with a dictionary and we don't memorize meanings of different things. Besides, we don't even know what those meanings are. And I think I talked about this when I was introducing the subject matter. I said, if you look at a dictionary, it's all circular, right? It's defined in terms of words are defined in terms of each other. So how does anyone ever understand what anything means? Because you're just going in a circle, right? If you have, all you have is a dictionary. But this idea of certain words not carrying over into different languages, that's an interesting one. I mean, I know what you're talking about because in Russian, there are some words that do not carry over just because the culture is different or the whatever. But it's mostly, I find it's mostly shades of meaning. You can always find a word that's pretty close, maybe not 100%, but shades of meaning, which is an interesting thing in itself. But anyway.
The other thing that I have noticed, because I teach all these ESL kids, I never knew this, but diphthongs don't exist in every language. And I'd have all these kids get these things wrong. And then I got like really geeked out mode where I was like researching all these languages, trying to figure out which ones had diphthongs and which ones didn't, and why do they have them? Why did they not, But I found, like, when I was a kid, I just thought grammar was like the most boring thing ever. But then when I started teaching English, I was just interested in the books. But I found that I really, really like grammar because it's like grammar is like the history of the world. And as the world changed and all these things happened, as people move from one part of the world to the other, they bring their languages with them. And then they start affecting each other's languages. So studying grammar is like studying history. It's fascinating, really. Yeah.
Thank you, Allison. Next up is Joe.
You said me.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm trying to think through what you've put on the table thus far, and then I'm trying to connect this to, and I don't know if there is a connection, and you may or may not know about the thought of experiment that
Which one?
Wittgenstein put together, the idea of a thought of what something is, like if it's in a box, that it has meaning to you, and that it really doesn't matter if it has meaning to someone else, that there's something, and I'm trying to relate it to this, and I can't recall the exact thought experiment, and I was just asking.
Yeah, I don't remember that one. I have to say sorry, Joe.
Okay, all right, sorry about that.
No
No
problem.
worries, no worries. What we'll do is we'll kind of walk around this, and as we circle around this concept, hopefully it'll become clear, and maybe we'll make those connections anyway. So going back to this idea of signifier and signified, I hope I'm making it clear that language, according to Saussure, is a system of signs, and the signs are these think of a circle, like, or think of two things that are bonded together, maybe like molecules, right? Atoms in a molecule, and the two things that are bonded is this sound image, or any kind of image, depending on whether you're talking or writing, or I mean, most of us, we're talking, right? We're not writing to each other because we have, it's much faster to speak than to write. So, but if we had to, we could use sign language and so on. So I'll just use the sound image because that's what Saussure refers to it. So we have this bond between the sound image, how something sounds in our head, we already know it, and some kind of concept, right? The concept, that's the semantical part. The sign together, that's the semiology, and that's this idea that we really all of our communication is based on these signs. We have the visual part, or some kind of part that touches our senses in some way, right? And then you have a part that doesn't touch our senses. That's the mental part. That's the concept part. That has nothing to do with our senses, right? You could be blind, mute, deaf, I mean, whatever. You still have some kind of concepts in your head. Like Descartes said, I can start from I am and develop, complex philosophy from that. So you can start from first things without having any kind of relation to the physical world, presumably, and still figure out kind of what everything is. So there's that. So semiology is the study of signs. Semantics, that's the study of meanings and concepts. And they're all tied up in this idea that language as a thing, the langue, right? Not the parole, but the langue, the system that underlies it, that underlies speech, is essentially a system of these signs. Now, the key observation again was that the bonding part is arbitrary. Now, that's a huge statement, because naturally, we would think that we're so used to naming words what they are. We come to think of words as, or the sound images rather, the signifier part, as somehow being intrinsically related to the signified. Now, once you learn another language, you kind of break that thinking, right? If you know more than two languages, or sorry, more than one language that are different, sufficiently different, right away that idea breaks down, because now you have the same concept in your head and you can express it in two completely different ways. Like for me, I happen to know English and Russian, so it's easy for me. I have a concept, I know that I can express it in two different ways. They sound nothing alike, and yet they're somehow tied with the same thing. And of course, all languages are the same like that, meaning that the bond between the sound image and the concept in each language is different. And it's what Saussure says, it's arbitrary. However, this is the key part. Once that bond is established, it is no longer arbitrary. And you can no longer, quote, choose what to identify with a given concept. In other words, you cannot go outside of that system. Once it's formed, and we don't know how exactly it's formed, but once it's there, it's like, concrete. Once it sets, that's it. And there's nothing you can do. In other words, in English, you cannot just decide that you're going to call something that we call an oak, that you're going to call it kludge. You know, you just can't do it. And the reason is, number one, whatever word you come up with, it's not going to be related to other concepts in the same way that oak is. And that leads us to this next question, which again, this is where we come to structuralism. How do we know the meanings of all these signs? And this is the third Saussure aha moment, where he realized that the way we know the meaning of anything has to do with how it's related to other words. And primarily, when he says related, what he means is how it's different from other words. So the difference in sound and the difference in meaning and the difference in context is how we understand the meaning of things. And let me illustrate this. So I'm going to say something in Russian, and I'm going to ask you what you thought I told you. I'm going to tell you a word, and you tell me what I am describing. Лицо. Okay. I touched my face, and I said a word. Now, the word I said was what? Was a Russian word for what? What do you think, rather?
Was it tears?
Sorry?
Was it tears?
No.
Nope. Like that, like something.
Yeah, I did like this, but okay. So yeah, so you think it's tears, Eleanor?
It's face.
Face, right? Yeah. Well, maybe you know Russian or something. I don't know. But anyway, but the point is, it's actually very hard. Just by me touching my face and saying a word, you don't know what I'm talking about. I could be talking about a tear. I could be talking about face. I could be talking about cheek. I could be talking about a lot of other things. How do you know ultimately what I mean? Well, you will observe how that word is used in other contexts, how it's different from related words. And at that point, that's how, as kids, that's how, when you grow up as an infant, as a child, that's how you understand the meaning of anything. You hear words over and over and over in different contexts, and you start building this network of connected meanings and associated sound images, using Saussure's terminology. And the slight differences, it's the differences that really count. It's not the similarities, because we understand the word, the différence, using French, if you want to sound sophisticated, the différence is what's important here. The difference in the shades of meaning and shades of context, and more importantly, how these things are related. Or not related, how they're different. Because think of words like oak and tree. I can point to an oak and say tree, and obviously I didn't tell you the name of that particular tree. I'm just telling you the name of a class of things, right? But you wouldn't know that if you're not an English speaker. You think maybe tree is what we call oaks in our, in whatever your language is. So the only way you would know that, though, is after observing how tree is used, in what context tree is used versus in what context oak is used. Or I could be pointing to a tree, and what I'm talking about is bark, or the trunk, or a myriad other things. And the only way you would know that is, again, if you start building this sort of a graph or a network of nodes and connections between them, and understanding that, okay, oak has connections to all these other things, but also maybe connections to something that's oak specific, right? Like acorns or whatever it is that it is connected to. That tree, the general concept of tree, is not necessarily as strongly connected to. And we do this instinctively. We build these connections as children very quickly. First of all, because we have a kind of a mind that's very, I think somebody said sponge. We're definitely like sponges when we're little kids. We soak it all in. It's much harder for us as adults to rebuild this network of meanings, especially in different language. We keep doing it though with our native language, right? We keep increasing the span of our network because that's how we learn new words, right? We already know what everything means, but then we have a new word like, I don't know, some SAT word, right, that we didn't know before. And when we say, okay, that's how it's connected into this framework. It is a slight combination of X, Y, and Z, and we know how it fits into the overall structure. And that's how we are able to learn new words. We fit it into the existing structure. So structuralism, and notice I said structure. That's what structuralism is. That the idea of structuralism is that things are not defined intrinsically. They're defined by connections and differences in those connections to other things. And that idea really started the ball rolling in anthropology, because people started realizing that you cannot look at cultures from the outside by just describing rituals, because that's crazy when you think about it. It's just like looking at words without understanding the connection, just transcribing the sounds without understanding how they fit together and how they interrelate. No, you have to look at it from the inside. And looking at it from the inside, you have to start understanding that, okay, these rituals really, if you start looking at them from the inside, they make a lot more sense because they're connected to this and to that. And together they weave some sort of complicated social system, a system of beliefs, a system of mythologies, and so on. And that's really, a tremendous insight, right? As opposed to just cataloging things and looking at primitive people and say, primitive in quotes, and saying, oh, well, they believed, that a son is eaten every night by whatever. And, oh, that's silly. And so on. And, oh, totems are, that's silly, like these animals represent your ancestors, and taboos and so on. Like all of these things, you have to look at them from the inside. And once you start doing that, then a completely different picture emerges. And you don't no longer look at it from a kind of from the eagle's eye of your superiority, but the eagle's view rather, but from the bottom up, right? You look at it from the inside and you see it for what it is. So that I'll stop there because I think there's a lot to unpack there.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Next up is going to be Maritza. Maritza, go ahead.
Sorry. I'm trying to process what this last part that he was saying. My comment was for earlier, the idea of sign is what I was thinking about. But now I'm stuck on the bonding he was talking about. Going back to sign, I was thinking it's really it's an interesting thing. Now, sorry, Phil made the comment about how if you've learned more than one language, you're starting to be able to see that a thing can be divorced from its signifier. Like they're not one and the same. And I think that acknowledgement or understanding of that difference also helps in the manner in which we can learn another language. Like, if one learns a language in a sterile environment where we're just given the sign for, like, somebody writes on the board cat and then top and then bird, and then you're given the other word for it in the other language. Now you just have kind of the sign, but there's not the attached context here. And because of that context being lacking, it's much harder for us to form that bond that Phil then went on to speak about. So it's like, if you learn a language kind of more naturally, like children learn a language, they're not actually taught the language, they kind of start to pick things up. And for them, they see this round thing with legs and they learn that eventually that's a table, right? And then they see another round thing with legs and that's a stool. But for them, they might call them both table initially, and only later they'll understand the difference. But I think they would make the distinction of stool because one can sit on a stool as opposed to a table where in general one would not. And that gives it a context. And again, obviously, because it's all words, they're all signs and signifiers, but I think this is a fascinating thing to look into, because in general, we just make assumptions that so many things are one and the same. And so there's the reminder of it being, you know, you need more, like for you know, the language that one is learning to stick, we kind of need to consider more than just what it literally is translated to. And I think I hear that in what Phil is saying with this concept of, you know, in addition to just the sign, we need the bonding. So that's just what I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Thanks for it.
you. Go ahead, Phil. Phil, would you like to add anything?
No, this is, yeah, I think where it's pretty much described it, I mean, I think she understands what I'm talking about.
Excellent. Next up is Bob. Bob, go ahead.
Hi. I don't know. I'm this thing about languages. I'm looking for a generalization, whether it's English or French, or just learning words. I mean, think of a child who has to learn what CAT, cat. What is that? And the way the child learns what that is by I don't know how I would say it, but how about experiential induction? Induction, you do a lot of experience and finally you figure out a cat. And I think of let's jump to an adult. Suppose that I use the word Pythagorean theorem. Sorry, that's 2 words, but Pythagorean theorem. Now, not everybody knows what that means. And if you want to learn what that means, regardless of which language you're using, you have to learn you can have a visual experience. You have to learn some mathematics, and you learn by induction. So I wonder if we learn the meaning of words by induction.
Yeah, I absolutely think that's what Saussure is saying, because it's not, you know, it's not an either or, right? What I was describing, where you figure out and you build up this, I mean, Saussure didn't say it network or graph, but that's how we kind of think of it today because of graph theory. And, you know, we have a pretty good idea of these types of systems in general, right? Let's think of a word system. When we say a system, right, what are we talking about? We're talking about things that are related in some way. And Saussure actually makes a statement that language is system par excellence. I mean, because what actually makes the language, the langue, right, not the parole, not the speech, but the langue, the system that underlies the speech, is a system of relations between signs. Right? So we have a sign, we have relations. Now, how do we find out what each sign means? That's exactly what you just said about induction. We do it experientially, yes. As a child, that's the only way we can learn. But specifically though, is it just association, right? Saussure would say, no, it's not just association, because again, if I point to a cat, to a child and say cat, what am I pointing at? Am I pointing at a small animal? Am I pointing at a specific animal? Am I pointing at his fur? Am I pointing while he's purring and making some noise? I mean, again, how does the child know all of that? It doesn't. And the only way it can learn is by comparing what sounds I'm associating in what context. And eventually, he figures out, or she figures out, that a cat is a specific animal, but not a Cheshire cat, right? Not a specific, I mean, there's so many shades of these meanings. There are tens of thousands of them, right? And each language has tens of thousands of words and tens of thousands of shades of meaning. And so the only way you can figure out what each word actually means, or approximately anyway, is by observing these differences. And that was Saussure's main observation or contribution in this linguistical study, is to say that how this whole thing works is, since everything is defined in terms of each other, right? All the words are defined in terms of everything else. The only way we can figure out what actually anything means is by observing this inherent graph or network of connections that we've built up around everything. And that's why he says that even though each particular signifier is arbitrary, Once it becomes part of the system, it is no longer arbitrary. None of them are. We cannot nilly-willy change what words are associated with which meanings. Now, they can change very slowly, and they do change, absolutely, but not arbitrarily, though. That's the main thing. But initially, it almost sounds like, not almost, but Saussure makes this point that initially, all these systems, they kind of arise, and they have arbitrary meanings associated with words. Bob, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would like to add the concept of boundaries. That is, if you want to define, you mentioned a lot of things. How do you tell whether it's this cat or cat in general? So, you can use boundaries to introduce negatives, like you can show a dog and say no, not dog. No, that's a dog. We want to stick to cat, and then I mean, I don't know how you would say I don't know how you would describe a specific cat as opposed to cats in general. Well, cats in general, maybe you would show 3 cats and say these are all cats, and I want to select a particular one. So there, maybe boundaries is only the word I thought of, but a boundary says no to what's outside of it, yes to what's inside.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree. Absolutely, yes, that's how you do. You actually jumping ahead a little bit, because the way he taught, I mean, we're all talking about the same thing. We just have different terminology, I think. The way he calls it is binary oppositions. So basically, the differences are built through these binary oppositions, and that's another term that has made its way into popular culture, postmodernism, and everything else. But anyway, I'll stop there because I think
Thank you.
Yeah, there's some other people that want to comment.
Next up is going to be Alison, followed by Eleanor. Alison.
I think the thing that's interesting about kids learning languages, because everyone always says that they learn languages really easily, but I think the thing is that there's a difference between, like, if a child moves to another country and they're just thrown in, they're going to learn language really, really fast because they want to make friends. And that really motivates them to learn the language. But when a child is exposed to a foreign language in their own country, like in a class, they don't really learn it that fast because they don't need to learn it. Like they learn the little bit that they need to for the class, but learning, in context is where you really, get everything. Like, I think it's not just, what you're, the classes, but it's like seeing the signs, seeing the food with the name on it, and you're associating with things. But, one thing Maritza was saying about how, in school, if you just see the word cat equals, shot or whatever. But I think really good, most language teachers don't do that, not good ones. And I think that's true whether you're talking about like kids or adults. I mean, I've had adult language classes like the Alliance Française, and they were amazing. And they were not doing that at all. It was very interactive, very like stand up, sit down, do this, do that, and a great language teacher will do that. But and then I think also, like, even with adults, when adults are plopped into another country for a while, like if they really go spend enough time, they're going to learn the language really fast, much faster than they ever would have,
Sure.
And also for the same reason, they're motivated to make friends. If you're going to live somewhere, you want to communicate. It's not like, if you're on vacation for a week, you're going home, but if you're going to be there for a year, you want to be able to communicate. But the other thing that I think is interesting is, the idea of the words being arbitrary, and they are, but onomatopoeias are so interesting because, like I always think of like the really old original Batman, boom, pap, but these words that they really do sound like what they are. And so I'm not going to say it, but there are certain Spanish curse words that they're just so much fun to say. They just sound like what they are, and I will not say it on YouTube, but they're just fun. I'm trying to learn Spanish now. It's going to be my third language if I can learn it. But, again, it's easier to learn the word when it sounds like what it means,
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah, I want to comment on that because Saussure obviously was aware of onomatopoeia, onomatopoeia rather, and he does mention, everybody knows these words, right? The words that sound like what they're describing, like the word
Yeah.
buzz, cuckoo. I mean, there's so many. However, Saussure mentions this phenomenon, and it says when you really compare, when you take all these words and you pile them up and you compare them against everything else, it's a very small part of the language.
Yeah.
So they're really fringes, right? So we obviously have a bunch of these, but they don't really form the core part of the language. Secondly, and this is really interesting, if you talk to different people from different backgrounds, try to tell them what a frog, how the frog sounds, or how some animal sounds. It will be different. I guarantee, and I know this for a fact. I'll give you, because the frog was such a good example. In English, the frog says ribbit, 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 right? But in Russian, it doesn't say ribbit. It says kwa, kwa.
I have a question for you. Okay, I know this woman she's Ukrainian, but her husband is Russian. And she said to someone yesterday, she said, "You are insane." And she said, "You are from a dying deer." And it was such a funny thing. And I kept thinking, is this an idiom in Russian or Ukrainian?
Dying
It's
deer?
just her. Like you're descended from a dying deer. Is this?
Never heard that one, but maybe
It might
that's
just
more regional.
I don't know, but it was so funny.
But going back to the onomatopoeia, that part is mostly, I would say, like anachronism. So in other words, it's an early part of the language where the concepts are not really there. We just look, we kind of imitate nature, and we can imitate and we can say the concepts. I mean, most of these words are related to nature, right? Yeah. These are all sounds that you're not going to be able to communicate about what we're talking about right now using words that sound, because there is nothing, what does culture sound like? What does language sound like, etc. So once you really get going, all of those fun words, they're left behind, basically. Yeah. But there's another category that Saussure addresses, and that's symbols. And symbols, unlike signs, are not arbitrary. And so symbols are also used in communication, and Saussure makes this interesting distinction between them. He says symbols, whether they are written, pictorial, or symbols in some, communicated in some other way, they are not arbitrary. They are actually intrinsically tied, and so they form a very good backdrop to signs, because signs, according to him, are arbitrary. And we could have picked a completely different sound image, and we have picked multiple sound images for the same exact concepts. But for symbols, once they are constructed, or the way they're constructed, they're actually very well and very meaningfully attached to their meaning. So think of a cross, think of a swastika, think of any number of symbols. Now, some of them can change their meaning, but they're still tied to that meaning in that context. And so they're no longer arbitrary. They are very much sort of built from the intrinsic connections. And that's how they're different from signs. That's why we don't use symbols in language, because it doesn't have the same flexibility. The whole idea of language is you have the flexibility to connect these things in, very intricate and interesting ways. But the symbols, they're kind of frozen. And so that forms an interesting comparison and backdrop to this idea of linguistics and language as a system of interconnected signs.
So Srikant stepped away for a moment, and so I'm just going to help out with, calling on people. Next up, we have Eleanor, followed by Ella, and then I have a clarification question that I would like to ask.
Eleanor, go ahead.
I think Joss just said he has a clarification question, isn't it?
I do, but I can wait since I'm kind of moderating now. I'll make myself last.
Okay. I kind of agree how kids learn what you said, Phil. But at the same point, I experienced in English that I actually need, it's not enough for me. If I would learn that way, watching people where they use certain words, I have such a feeling I would only speak 1/3 of a language. Because there are words you cannot point on anything, such as philosophy or psychology. They are very difficult words, which I don't know. And it doesn't matter what language I speak, I have to look them up, what they mean. So as I learned all languages I speak a little bit differently. I mean, I learned one language reading books and translating word by word. Another language I had no time to learn, but I had mostly to work, and my work is in, it has an own language. We even don't speak, we just have signs. It's kind of like programming language. But it's just short paintings, you know, crosses and pluses and minuses and numbers. That's how I work. And I could work probably even in Japan. But English, I was a little bit lazy because I didn't have enough time, and I started kind of like just listening. But I figured out when I read, and I read already pretty quick, I still don't understand a lot because I never translated anything. I never had time to look words up and to write them down. So this is a problem actually, because then I cannot use them actively. Writing words and looking them up in dictionary makes you really aware of what the meaning is. And I have to, it's just by, when I want to get higher and read high-end books in psychology, it's just this association how kids work doesn't function for me personally anymore.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, absolutely, you're absolutely right. I mean, what can I say? The you know, the words that describe concepts, they're not easy to associate with anything, right? Because they're not physical.
Yeah.
So how do we do it? Well, according to Saussure, I mean, we do look them up in a dictionary, absolutely. But how does that work? How do we actually understand? How do we form a new concept when we look at it in the dictionary definition? Well, the dictionary, what it does, essentially, if you think of words as like these nodes, these points in this system of connected things, right? What a dictionary does, it says, okay, draw another node that is close to this one and this one and this one. And we already have built up this whole infrastructure of all the related other things that are related to this. So it's easy for us when we are given kind of an address, if you will, a destination to put another concept on. It's very easy for us to place it exactly where it belongs. And once we use it a couple of times, then we remember how it relates to all the other things. So I remember, like, and I'm still doing this, by the way, in English, you know, if I hear a new word, I'll look it up in the dictionary, but the dictionary will tell me, hopefully, some synonyms, right, for that word. But it will also tell me something about the context. It will say, okay, well, I don't know, pick some word that, let's say, demeaning, okay? What is demeaning? Well, it's somewhere between maybe insulting and somehow trying to devalue you, so that we have all these, I have all these other concepts that I can kind of place the word demeaning. If I didn't know what it meant before, I can sort of place it next to these other ones, and then I have that. And then I have some other word that could be, you know, like enhance. Okay, so enhance, there's a concept of good and bad, there's a concept of degrees. So there's, in other words, we've built this thing out. We take it for granted as adults that we've already have this amazing network of meanings all in our head. But we're not memorizing a dictionary, right? That's not how we built it up. Now we can use a dictionary because we already have this infrastructure. And in fact, when I would posit that when we learn a new language, we're not starting from zero again. What we're doing is we're taking the existing infrastructure from whatever language we learned as a kid, as a child, and we are attaching a whole parallel structure right next to it that is kind of mirroring, right? That's what happens when you learn another language. They'll translate it, right? They'll say, okay, this word means this. And you say, okay, well, I know kind of, that's easy. And then you start building this. Now, the real sort of quantum leap happens is when you stop building it based on this parallel universe and you start defining words in a new language in terms of other words in that language. So for me, that already happened way back when I started dreaming in English and thinking in English and so on. I was no longer translating it. Now I have to work harder in Russian and not to try to translate it to English. I just have to, because I'm speaking English all the time.
My experience showed it just takes 5 years to adjust to any language proper. And if you want to go even higher, it takes you almost 10 years.
Oh,
but a couple languages like Polish, Ukrainian, I can understand. Yiddish, I can understand, but I can't speak. But I would walk through stores and I would think, I can understand them, but I still cannot talk, and cannot write. And this is funny. So it takes, there are different levels of how to participate and be active. And just understanding from deriving words, this is what I do with Polish. When I hear Polish people talking, I can take out a lot from their language, and I will literally get into content and even respond in English, but I wouldn't be able to talk.
Right.
This is a different level of learning too, So it's kind of like almost not useful, but it's kind of useful, but not really.
Well, that actually gets back to this idea of the difference between, remember the iceberg metaphor? Parole, which is the language we speak, is just the tip. And so when you're a new speaker, all you get is this tip of the iceberg. What you have to do is you have to build up all that infrastructure, all that system that's below the water that you don't necessarily observe. That's the trick, right? That's the hard part. But as you see the different parts of that iceberg showing above the sea level, then you build up kind of all the underlying grammar and so on, all the relationships and the rules of speaking. Yes. Okay, Joe, who do we have? Who do we have next?
We have Ella next. Go ahead, Ella.
Okay, thank you. Yes, based on everything has been said, great insight. I was going to address not the infrastructure itself, but what might lie beneath the infrastructure. And so this sort of goes back to the philosophy aspect, I guess. And I was thinking that based on some things that you said, Phil, and others have contributed, that these symbols that seem to be universal or innate, for lack of a better word, these symbols that are there. I'm trying to think, and I'm thinking through the lens of, an idealist would say, well, or let's say Kant would say, well, you can't know the thing in itself. You can't, you just know your ideas. And, and so we are in our ideas when we are on this basic level beneath the system. And so what I'm trying to discern, and I'm not saying it's Plato's forms or Jung's archetypes or whatever, but I'm trying to discern if there's something from a philosophical standpoint that may point to and Kant says, you know, what you can't know the thing in itself, but he believed that, you know, time and space would be beyond, you know, would be what we could reasonably conjecture. So and yeah, you know, and so is there any of this symbolically, this language, especially not in the expressive realm, but on the deeper level, beneath the system itself, that might be inherent in our nature as humans, or our nature in, you know, you could think of this two ways. You could think of your, you know, humans have been around a long time. Have we inherited some kind of understanding of a tree, so that when a child goes to learn what a tree is, they may not know the exact word in a particular culture, but do they have some sort of basic understanding, the deeper level of a tree anyway, so that they're more open to that due to, you know, our ancestral heritage that we all have as humans? And or could it just be something that's not necessarily genetically given to us, but some other way? But that's my thought and my question.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to have to disappoint you, Elle, because as I started with this in the beginning to say that linguistics is still an open battleground. I think there are lots of different camps. Some people do believe that a lot of these things are innate, including things like ability to formulate grammars. Famously, Noam Chomsky, which you probably all know, developed this idea of generative grammars, and the idea that we in fact have something in us, almost at the genetic level, that allows us to produce the system, the lung, you know, the system of languages. And then other people disagree completely with that. And I guess I would say probably Saussure disagrees with the idea of anything being innate. Partly, I would say, because of the next point. I guess this could be my segue into that next point, maybe final point, which is that languages can be studied in two different ways, or looked at in two different ways. One is what he calls synchronic, which is looking at a language at a point in time as a system that exists at a given point, and examining that system from the inside, like we were talking about. But the second way to look at language is diachronic, which is through time, which is to see how a particular system changes. And when you look at how a particular system changes, and I think we've done that through the lens of Owen Barfield and some of these other thinkers, you see something completely different. You see meanings are changing. You see that the sound images are changing according to specific rules and according to specific, almost, I would say, like laws of linguistics, right? Certain sounds just don't change willy-nilly. They also have, there's different rules for how a particular consonant can change to another consonant, or a vowel can change or get contracted, and so on. So anyway, point being that there's definitely evidence that the whole thing is very fluid, and it's not clear if it is fluid, then how is it in any shape or form innate? And of course, you also have different grammars, and you have different rules for language. And to make matters even worse, how do you explain, if we have this innate ability, how do you explain the fact that most people cannot write and cannot speak properly and make mistakes on simple exams and so on? So there's all kinds of interesting questions that are debated very hotly in the field. It's still a new field, a nascent field, and these are all, I would say, all unanswered. There's not really a consensus. There are different schools of thought, and some of these schools are, it's very difficult to prove one way or another. That's another thing, right? Unlike physics or chemistry, languages, how do you prove something, right? In the sphere, you're almost dealing with like paleontology, right? Things that have happened in the past, things that are happening now. But even in the synchronic study of language, looking at a given language like English as a system, it's not at all clear to explain how these rules are built up, right? How we get the shades of meaning, how exactly we generate this beautiful infrastructure of connected, interrelated meanings. We can observe it, we can, like Bob pointed out, we can do this inductive learning by association and learning by difference and learning by opposition and so on. But it's still not exactly clear how these things exactly function and how they are built up. We just kind of, at a certain point, we realize that we can talk and we can understand each other, and we have this thing kind of completed, probably by age of 5 or 6, I would say. We have most of it already built up very early on. And then later, all we're doing is we're just enhancing what's already there. The structure is already in place. Did we have some, Joe, do we have someone else?
Phil, it's a question for you. How many more units do you have to present? Do you have more things to present?
Oh, no, this is almost the end. I would say this is this idea of the diachronic versus synchronic is pretty much the last important point. After that, it's all just little notes I have.
Okay,
So
let's keep the little notes aside.
yeah.
So what I want to do, I do have comments on this, because language has been a topic of great interest to me. And I think we have done a number of meetups on language. So I'm going to just talk personally. I know I don't understand language very well, because it is almost as complex a topic as reality itself, because it is like our way of grappling with reality. And what I find is that almost all linguistic theories are just very primitive attempts at trying to grasp something. So it's like you're trying to, it's this, reality is this massive network. And in order to grasp it, we have this language, which is this massive network.
Yep.
That is operating in our brain, which is a massive network. And it is going on between people, which is a massive network, operating over time, across space. So the complex, and language is something that is floating on the top of all the relationships between the massive network of our brain, the massive social network that we have that is going back, and it's bi-directional. Everything affecting everything else, and all of it is taking place in reality, which itself is a complex network. In some ways, most thoughts on language are trying to kind of do 1, 2, 3 line in trying to trace a line through this massive network, and it's just all very pitiful attempts to try to grasp. And it's like, everybody tries to come up with their own theory, and it's just doesn't do justice to the complexity and the grandeur of what it is. And there is grandeur in language, because it is a medium through which we are conscious of existence. So it is the full grandeur of existence combined with full grandeur of an individual consciousness, combined with the full grandeur of the socialness that we have and how much we go back and forth with each other. And language is just something that is happening as a medium that is making all of this thing possible somehow. So I think, I try to approach language with that humility, that whatever we have is quite primitive. It's whatever conceptions I have of language are relatively primitive compared to the grandeur of what language just is. It's not idealistic language, will be just what our language is, what is going on in the minds of the most inarticulate being today is something that, with the maximum articulation capable to me, I'm not able to grasp. So that's my kind of general approach to language. So I don't know whether Phil, you have any comment on that.
Well, I like what you said, that language is as complex as reality. I think that's a very accurate statement. What I thought of when you said that was famous remark by Jean Baudrillard, that the map is the territory. And in fact, language is the map for the territory, right? Language is how we map reality.
Let's build up on this. Phil, is it okay? Joe, is it okay if I go back and forth with Phil a little bit? Because I want to kind of go through these various theories of language. So let's look at this map and territory, okay? I think it's very beautiful. I mean, the best thinker I know of language is by far Julian Jaynes. I've not seen anybody who comes even close. And the way he's talking about it, he's saying that, you know, consciousness is an analog of reality, that consciousness is a map of reality. But it's a very interesting kind of map. You know, it's like map has its own means of writing. And there is two things going on. There is map making going on and map using going on. So you are abstracting out. And this is a very interesting point. So it is, in a sense, it is an analog. It is a metaphor of reality. So there is reality base for it, but then there is something unique to the consciousness. For example, we have these words. Reality, there isn't that many words floating around or sounds floating around, and we have to convert everything into words. And there are images that are there in reality, but they have to be abstracted out so that you can look at all of France on this little piece of paper that you draw, though the actual France has a far more complexity than that. So you have to kind of simplify. So you have to transform what is there in reality to make the map. So there is this one process of making the map. But it is not about making the map. Life is about making the map so you can use it to navigate in the territory, move in the territory, do things in the territory. So there is this loop going on between the territory and the map.
Yep.
And that loop is continuously changing the territory and continuously changing the map. If you want to make it
Sure.
more profound, the biggest territory we are working on is society, is each other.
Absolutely.
So we are using maps, we are creating maps based on our interaction. We're creating the maps of interaction.
Yep.
In our mind, and that we are using in order to drive the interaction, which is transforming what is going on outside, which is again transformed. And this is what everybody is doing. There is commonality in the maps of everybody, and we are sharing maps, and we're trying to, work with our maps, but they are different maps. So each of us has a different map. There is commonality between maps, but they're not exactly the same. And you will have some more detailed things in the map, some areas. I will have detailed things here. I might have a way of expressing things in the map which is slightly different than yours. For example, my map may capture the social emotions a little bit better. Your map may capture the social context, physical context, a little bit better. But if we are actually talking to each other in a conversation, maybe each of us transfers some of that aspects of territory that we have captured in our own maps back and forth. So there are several elements. So there is map and territory. Second is the loop going on between that, and consciousness as being kind of mapping and map using thing. And language is being the tool. It's kind of the map. Is what I'm saying. So what do you think about this metaphor of thinking about language?
Well, it's definitely true. Saussure already notes that when you think about speech, spoken language versus the system that underlies it, that's there's a feedback loop between those two. You can't speak unless you have the rules, right? So because otherwise you're speaking into nothingness, right? Nobody can understand you. But at the same time, how do you form the system? It requires a network of these signs, right? So and the signs are concepts associated with sound images, right? What he calls sound images. So absolutely.
So I want to make one point about this. This is what I thought of when you're making the point about this. In some ways, James has a middle term, which makes this really, really interconnected. The map and the territory more interconnected, and that's the concept of metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
So what he's saying is that for a map maker, he uses the terms for metaphor. A metaphor, basically, it's a general term to encompass similes and everything. That's how he uses it. It's a general concept.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically the concept of using something that you know better in
Mm-hmm.
order to deal with something that you don't know as well.
Right.
It is transfer. It is a transferring mechanism.
Transference, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's transfers.
Yep.
So and it's a very complex transfer mechanism. It is bidirectional transfer mechanism. So for example, when you're making a map, the metaphor, metaphor is the tool that you know well, that you're using.
Right.
Is actually France. You're seeing France.
Mm-hmm.
And the metafront, the thing that you're modifying, is the map.
Right.
But when somebody is using the map, the metaphor now is the map. He doesn't know France.
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to use that in order to travel in this unknown territory, which is France. So there is that play between. Now, the beauty of metaphor is that metaphor concept is that it provides the middle term. So there is a sound, and the abstraction is related to things that you know, typically and his great point is that typically at a perceptual level. So the perceptual is connected to the sound that you're producing. So it's a perceptual, and then that perceptual gets transferred into something more conscious based, more abstract. So abstractions are like analogs of perceptual things. And this you can see, for example, the best examples you can see are in the Bible. So you have the spirit, which is the wind. It's the same name for the wind, and which is the same name for soul. Same name for breath. So breath, soul. So it gets transferred from wind outside to the physical breath to the spirit. So spirit is a spiritual, what is going on in your consciousness. And that is related to your breath. And that is related to the wind outside. And blood goes from like blood to courage. And so many things go like this between physical things into abstract things. And that provides like the middle term. So it is not completely, so it is all metaphor based, and each language will have its different metaphors. So not only the signifying word is different, but the entire complex or system of metaphors used to make sense of reality for each language is slightly different, and each person is different, because the entire scope of English language is available to you. The words that you actually use and the metaphors that you're actually using is a much smaller subset of that. So in that sense, you have your own limited set that you're using. And there is a lot of overlap between, there are some common things and some would be outside. And also how frequently you use it and how much does your life depend on those words. That also is another factor. So there is a tremendous life in all of these, and which is sometimes missed by people who are trying to analyze it. They try to get this one. So in trying to analyze it, or analyze means to cut it, they lose the life of the whole, whole network. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, what you were talking about with spirit and breath, we covered that with Owen Barfield, where we talked about how essentially the further back you go, language becomes more and more like poetry. In other words, there's nothing that's not poetry. It's all poetry. And the reason it's all poetry is because it's all using things that we are now using as, it's using these words that are now metaphorical, have metaphorical meaning, but they're used literally. And that creates the connections that we've lost, right? It reawakens our consciousness to the consciousness of those people that looked at breath and spirit and wind, it's all the same thing to them, but we don't look at it that way. We've like you said, we've analyzed it, we've classified it, we've made our tight compartments, and we don't think of it as one thing. So when we go back and read those old texts that look at it as one thing, it's poetical, right? It has this metaphorical content that we've lost. And so that's definitely the case. Now, the interesting part is how that changes, that's the diachronic study of languages. You look at one language, like English, for instance, and you study how the meanings of given words have changed throughout history. And that gives us, essentially, as Barfield said, a history of consciousness, because language as a system reflects reality, but reality is not physical. Reality is how we perceive it. So it really, it reflects reality insofar as it reflects the consciousness of the people that have put together and have preserved for us that infrastructure as it existed, let's say, in 11th century, in 15th century, and now 20th century. And of course, the language today is different than the language 100 years ago. We have different consciousness and we use different words, some words that did not exist. Like a word meme that Richard Dawkins basically created. That was an amazing thing, right? He actually created a word. He took a concept, he associated a sound image with it. We all decided that collectively that was a good idea. And now we have a word meme, and we now use it in a different way that he wanted us to use it, right? He had a very specific meaning. Now memes, that's a little picture on the internet of people dancing or whatever. It took a life of its own. That's what's fascinating about this. We actually see the speed of this is really accelerating. We can now observe the evolution of consciousness, evolution of these terms right before our eyes, because things are happening so fast, and we're able to agree and come to these consensus on these new terms. And it's really like something unbelievable. Before, it took much longer because we didn't have internet, we didn't have the instant connectivity, and in order to create a word or a concept, you had to do it. I mean, it had to really be either a revolutionary new thing, or it had to travel for a long, long time and settle in and become like concrete. Like we talked about concrete, it has to kind of settle in so that other people recognize that meaning. Otherwise, it's useless. If I just say, if I make up some word, thingamajigga, and it doesn't mean anything to anybody, well, nobody's going to use it. But if it's a useful term like meme, then it becomes widespread. People use it, and it gets a place in this network of meanings, right? It becomes a thing that we can associate other things with that, and we can peg other associated meanings to that. And that's how this whole thing keeps growing, like that map and territory.
Wonderful. Thank you, Phil. All right, next up is going to be, what's that? Yeah.
Eleanor proposed
Yeah.
to the chat spork,
Yeah.
spoon and fork. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly like that.
Yeah. Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Bob. Joe.
Yeah, the evolutionary aspect is actually very interesting so far as that you were talking about it, in that how the evolution of language over time, that would mean like that we become increasingly conscious as we get older. I guess that's part of the maturation process. Am I understanding that correctly? So like you're evolving, you're constantly evolving, and essentially becoming more aware. But I do have another question for you.
I don't think so. And maybe you think so, but I don't think so. I've not seen. Have you seen people get more conscious as they grow older?
No. I mean, that's just the way it sounded. Is the description as far as what Phil was talking about.
What Oh, what
Phil get?
Phil, do people get more conscious as they grow old?
Or there's an
hope so.
evolution.
I certainly hope so. I hope they get more conscious of being alive, more alive. So yeah, I'm an optimist there. I think I'm more conscious than I was of things around me. Yes, I do believe that.
So the other is that you talked a lot about like kind of putting it into a graph, and that's actually very interesting to me. And I was wondering if you could actually expand on that and how that would look. You talked a little bit about mapping nodes together and concepts and ideas. I initially think of like an RDF graph. I know that's not what you're talking about, but that's what I think about.
Actually, no, that's precisely what I'm talking about. RDF is, for those who don't know, it's a particular standard on the internet for describing semantic connections between things. It's a logical description of how concepts and how things relate to each other. In such a way that it's primarily used by computers, but still it gives us a good idea because we do something like this internally. And so how does this work? Well, again, Saussure doesn't explain the psychological aspect of this. This is, I think, where Piaget and some of these other thinkers come in. But he explains the kind of the end result. And so the end result is kind of like where we started with, let's say you have a concept of parents, okay? And connected, right, so right away you have this thing called parents. Right away you have something that will say, okay, parents and mom and dad are all related concepts. Now they're different, and this is where you understand, how is mom different from dad? Well, mom is a woman and dad is a man. I mean, or whatever differences you can think of in your mind, you already have this kind. It's very simple, right? You have to, mom, dad, sounds are different, right? And then in your mind, you have a picture of what mom is as a thing and what dad is as a thing. And you constantly, as a child, you will constantly adjust that definition of what constitutes that definition. And some people have mentioned that little kids, what they will do is they will initially, they generalize everything, right? Because they don't know any better. So to them, right, a person who has a deep voice is dad, or they'll call him dad, and then they'll realize that no, not every person that is a man is my dad. It's only this man that's my dad. But it takes them time actually to work it out. And so in this graph, some of the connections that were there, they keep adjusting. Now it's association, yes, but it's also, and this is the key, again, key insight, that the only real way we can figure out the different meanings is in fact by comparing and doing the subtraction, a difference. What is the difference between a tree and an oak? What is the difference between an oak and bark? And you keep slicing it and dicing it until you've really isolated the connections. And then once you have this graph, and again, I think it happens very early on, like I want to say 5 to 6 years old, we have most of that, 99% of that graph is done. The only thing that's left is the words that are very easy for us to place within that. All the SAT words, all these complex philosophical words, we can very easily place them after that because they all relate to things that are well established in this network of connections. And how this, and the connections themselves, by the way, are very similar, since Joe, you brought up RDF as a connection framework. We have a thing that in RDF, for instance, there's a connection that's called, this is a generic instance of something else. And inversely, this is a specific instance of this class. So let's say we have a class called human, and Shrikant and Joe are instances of that class. And so we don't think along those lines scientifically. We just do it kind of in our heads. which is why some people have suggested that we have some sort of genetic built-in mechanism for doing this. Who knows? But that's what we're doing. We're saying, okay, there's a general thing, and then there's a specific thing, and we're going to make that very quickly, that association that this is a class and this is a class, and there's instance of that class. And then you can say, okay, we have an enumeration of things, right? So a constitution is an enumeration of laws. And so we have this very quick association between things that are composites, right? Things that are really defined only as composites of other things. So a book is a composite of pages. Pages as word. And so we have these one-to-many relationships, almost like, you know, in a computer, but not exactly like that. But yes, but that's how it's all kind of gets built up, is just through these types of differences and shades of meaning and associations, but mostly differences.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Bob, followed by Katie. Joe, if you want to go, we'll go next after Katie. Is that okay?
Okay, sure.
Bob, go ahead.
Okay, I wanted to reflect a little bit about what Shrikant said, that a language is a marvelous thing. If there is a reality out there, and reality is awfully complex, and each of us has one. What language is, this is the proposal, is an attempt to create symbols for each part of reality. It's a whole set of symbols. Now, a dog might be able to create have a language of say 100 as a count, but human beings have an expanded, have a special kind of brain, whereas we are able to create symbols in the tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. Now, so that's what language is. But language can be organized. Well, tell me if this is true. Every language has nouns, verbs, and adjectives. Nouns are kind of fixed. Adjectives indicate emotion, or how things are related, movement, how things are related, and adjectives are modifiers. So I wonder if every language has that. Now, I don't know what Chomsky has done, but if a language has nouns, verbs, and adjectives, you can still make sense. You don't have to have a particular order. I think English and German has different orders in the way we present our sentences. So that's a simplification of my understanding. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, to answer your question, I'm pretty sure every language does have the nouns, verbs, and adjectives, which is why Chomsky actually proposed his theory, because otherwise it would not work, right? If every language did not have it, then his grammar is dead in the water, you know, before it gets going. So his idea is, in fact, that there's a way to generate, using this, what he calls universal grammar, to create these rules for generating sentences, and essentially like all language. The problem is it's not clear, if we have this universal grammar built in, why do we generate 10,000 different languages, not just one, right? It would seem that we would generate a one specific implementation that works best, but in fact we've generated thousands of variations, right? I mean, languages number in thousands, and they all have different grammars that are not exactly the same. So case in point, like you mentioned, word order. Some languages have a specific word order, like English does have a specific word. You can't just fix. Some other languages don't, like Russian. You can mix and match, and you want to emphasize something, you'll start with that. Or you want to emphasize it, you put it towards the end. Doesn't matter. Still the same meaning. Anyway, so languages are different like that, but they do have that common. They do have common building blocks, and if you abstract away from the actual rules of how you put words together, and operate strictly at the word level, which is what Saussure pretty much does. He doesn't really dive into syntax and grammar. He goes into one level above that and says, okay, well, let's just assume we all know how to put these words together, because I can say a word and you'll know the meaning, or I can say two words even in the wrong order, and you can still figure out what I'm saying. Like if I'm a foreign speaker, I'll put like alarm, fire. I don't know how to put it together properly, but you will know what I'm talking about. But how do I get to the point where we both know what alarm and what fire, what they actually signify? That's this idea of signs and how they relate. And that's really the level at which Saussure makes most of his novel suggestions or discoveries, if you will. And those are then later taken up by the anthropologists, by psychologists, by sociologists, and so on.
All right, go ahead, Bob.
I would suggest that the order doesn't matter that much. I mean, you're right, you can pick out the meaning. But the reason why we're able to do that is that we have enormous brains. If you go back to the dog has a simple brain, and it cannot do nouns and verbs very well. Maybe a little
adjectives.
or well, forget about adjectives. But we have enormous brains, and it's been developed. They are developed over long evolutionary periods. So we're able to mix things up, and the building blocks are nouns, verbs, and adjectives. So there's your explanation.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bob. Next up is going to be Katie, Joe, and Ella. And Phil, you need to go by 10 o'clock, or what's your?
I can stick around for a little bit longer since we started early.
Okay, go ahead, Katie.
It's just a very, very quick point. Sanjay had asked about bringing up more topics, because he did kind of start to cover that about generic, a generic case, or like the concept of a dog and versus your own dog, and discussion has been picking up really well for that. That was the only one where I felt like the discussion didn't pick up and I didn't walk away understanding. So we might want it, just because he asked, I would be interested.
Sorry,
Oh, sorry.
Katie, I did not understand what you said. Are you saying that you have a recommendation for a topic for Sanjay?
Yeah, Sanjay had asked what we were interested in learning about, and I felt like that he had given a presentation on the concept, like exactly what Philip was saying. I couldn't articulate it the other night, like class of a dog, like the concept of a dog, and but then your brain makes the connection to this dog, and he had explained it, but it didn't end up getting carried into a conversation.
Katie, could you do me a favor? Can you go ahead, if you go to Meetup and look at the past Meetup of Sanjay, you can just click on him and send a message to him and just put all of this directly, and he will get it from there. Okay. Thank you, Katie. Appreciate that.
Is this meetup on neurophysiology?
Yeah, neuroscience. I mean, it's very interesting because Sanjay is doing a magnificent job of taking the advances in neuroscience and making it accessible to anybody who wants to learn about it. And he's very, very patient. He's very knowledgeable, and he's able to put it in forms which, most people can get. And he's dealing with this entire swath of subjects, as you can imagine, it's like everything produced by the brain.
Right.
So this is, he had asked for, feedback on what topics people would like to do. And so it's good because I always like to have people give feedback directly, because each of the person has their own way of putting it, own color and own emphasis. And for the people who are presenting, that's a very useful feedback. So thank you, Katie. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Ella. Joe.
So I was just going to do a quick follow-up on what you were talking about with this parent-child relationship, and how we can infer things and connect objects based on that. So that if you have the idea of a person, then a man and a woman, right? And then you have identifiers like names and everything that go along with that. And then you have a child, right? Then you could start to connect those concepts of man, woman, child, like, but you have the first concept of a person. And this is the way we actually start to develop what what the entities are, and what the relationships between the entities, the roles and relationships between the entities, and then the resource aspect of it, which is the kind of what the resource would be the descriptor, like the identifier,
Right.
for the individual. Right. So then you could start to put these into context, and then what it ultimately allows is you to infer as to what, and these are kind of where rules come into language, because once you have a set of rules, you can start to make inferences that allows you to build your understanding of the world. And is that kind of where this is all going in a way? Or what you're thinking when you're talking about graphing? Graphing.
Well, I mean, graphing is just the way we typically talk about relationships these days, right? So when you think of a system and relationships, what's the easiest way to picture that? Well, we just draw a little circle and put little blobs in that circle, and then connect the little blobs with lines, meaning that they're somehow related to each other. And I think I started out by saying, the anthropologists started doing this by looking at various rituals and various relationships in, let's say, a tribe, and trying to understand what's going on, not by just analyzing each thing individually, but by trying to figure out how these things relate to the overall structure that emerges from this. And this is where structuralism comes in. But yes, it's essentially that. It's essentially building up this relationship system. Graphically, we represent it easily as a graph, because it's like, for people with engineering backgrounds, I guess it's easy for us to think of it as a graph or a network of connected things. For people that are more, I guess, intuitive, think of it just a system of connected entities, right? Think of a town as a system of connected streets, or a population, or as family as connected individuals, right? We're all connected in some way, and we make up a particular system, and then these systems make up larger systems, and so on. So in language, same idea. By the way, the same can be said of in terms of differences, the same can be said of sounds. We take it for granted that we can decode speech, because we know the boundaries. I think Rob talked about boundaries. We know the boundaries of words. So when I say something, even if I say it really fast, you can identify the breaks between words, right? And that's how you can decode the entire sentence. Now, listen to a language that you don't know, and you will see how difficult it is to figure out where the boundary is. To you, it's just a stream of sounds. Like, I remember when I was trying to learn Spanish, I'm still trying to learn Spanish, listening to Spanish people talk, especially when they talk really fast. I have no idea if it's 10 words or 5 words. I mean, it's just a stream of sounds. But how do we, once you start learning it, what happens? Well, what happens is we identify the difference in sound from we start associating meanings with these sound images, and then our auditory part, the auditory organs of hearing, we can now, as we hear the stream, we break it up really quickly, because we know that this part is this word, and then whatever comes next, that's going to be part of the next word, which we're going to hear in a second. And then you break it up again, and you break it up again, and then you do it automatically. You don't even think about it. But in reality, it's just a stream of sounds, right? Just like, or think of Hebrew. Ancient Hebrew didn't have breaks in the sentence. So it's just a stream of characters. How do you read it? Well, you have an association of words with concepts, and you see, you have a visual association in this case, and you just pick out the words as you look at the stream of characters, which has no periods, no commas, no anything. It's just a stream. If you look at Old Testament in like the scrolls, I mean, that's something. I mean, it's just like, think of numbers without any breaks, just going down the list. So anyway, the way we do it is because we have these conceptual points of difference where we say, okay, this is how we differentiate this sound from everything else. We're able to pick it out like that. And this concept of opposition and difference is what allows us to mediate.
Infer.
Yeah, infer, make the inferences and make everything kind of work.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Ella. Ella, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I don't think I'll think of language in the same way. I've always had, well, you know, it's linked to philosophy, and I know I've worked in the field and I know how important it is, but I don't think I've ever thought of it with such an importance to. I like the way you described it, Shrikant, in the universal and individual consciousness and collective unconsciousness. That sort of puts language, you know, and you said that language was a medium of all of these systems. And so I thought that was interesting. I'm going to keep that one. I like that perspective. And yeah, as far as the yeah, I agree. There is an objective reality. Well, I can't say definitively, but I think many would say that there is objective reality, and that we don't necessarily have access to it. This has been alluded to here, that you know, through our senses and our perceptory devices, we may perceive a tree. It's not going to be represented in our mind as the actual tree. It's a representation. It's like there's a difference. But if there is an objective reality, which that's my premise here, I don't know how language, even though obviously everything that is said is absolutely true, that it changes over time and it's very, very relative and so forth. But if there are trees in objective reality, there's been a family unit in objective reality since way back, you know, caveman times. You can change the idea of a tree or a family. They still may exist, but maybe you're just modifying them. But the actual reality is there. So that's my thought. And that maybe Chomsky is right. I have to look more into it, but yeah, I mean, maybe there is something underlying, some kind of universal template underlying the language, because, well, there are a number of reasons. I have to look into it more. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. I mean, I'm not familiar with Chomsky. I've never had interest in reading him, but I find that really the great exponents of language are some of the poets, because, you know, Owen Barfield captures it, because it's like these guys actually capture some aspects of language which are at the level of the network. So for example, Owen Barfield says, you know, what creates this felt transformation of consciousness? You see, that is a delta of language. It is saying it is that alive part of you. It's like you got something now, and then capturing it as a combination, or not combination, it at once is an aesthetic experience and an epistemological experience at the same time. So it's just profound. And in terms of the tree and us, I mean, I think that Julian Jaynes' idea that consciousness is an analog of reality is very powerful, because what it does is that it focuses, also is very much focused on the fact that we are living beings. So we are actually interacting with the tree. It is the tree. We are actually going to go based on our analog of the tree. We are going to go water the tree. We are going to tend to its fruit. We are going to go back and forth with it. We are going to prune it. We are going to, so there is not, it's not just passive. No, it is not one directional. It is bi-directional, and we transform reality. And it's nowhere as clear as in the social realm, that our speech and our grasp of what is going on with a group shapes our action, and that shapes what is going on in the group. That comes back. So there is this tremendous amount of back and forth that is there in the language. And then, you know, and this is part of the human experience. And what you're really looking for, and this is all given, you know, and much of it is subconscious, automatized, you know, routinized way. You know, when I'm speaking, I'm not deliberately choosing any of the words. Most of the words I'm speaking just come to me with the intention. And then when I see something new, something else happens that expands my grasp of what is going on one step further. So it is very interesting. It's like, because our brains are so amazing, and because the reality is so amazing, and because the tool of language that we have is so amazing, that, you know, though we don't grasp it, we are, you know, we are the, what shall I say, the beneficiaries of this great reality, our great, you know, our great brain, our great linguistic tools that we have. And we are just trying to figure out what we are doing. We are actually doing it, but we're trying to figure out what we are doing. Thank you, Ella. All right. So Phil, thank you so much. Can you give us an overview of what next meetups are coming up?
All right. So I think we're going to take a little bit of a break from linguistics, and we'll look at Carr's little essay or small book, I guess, on what is history. It is actually connected to a lot of things we're talking about, because it has to do with interpretation, it has to do with kind of context and semantics and so on. So we'll look at that next time, and I think we'll come back to linguistics after that with, I think it's Roland Barthes and mythology and what is it, mythology and symbols, I think, something like that. So that's coming in the next couple of weeks.
Wonderful. All right, folks. So this is wonderful. Thank you so much. I mean, I am loving this series and everything that Phil is doing, because he's, you know, bringing so much into the conversation here. So thank you very much, Phil, and we'll see you soon.
All right.
Bye.